Hello, so this is the poem Half-Caste. I'm going to show you how to annotate it and talk through the meaning as we go. So Half-Caste, the context for this poem is that John Agard was born in Guyana, which is the very northern part of South America, just above Brazil, borders onto the Caribbean, and it's a very ethnically diverse area with lots of people of very mixed heritage, primarily because of slavery. So the native population were Native American, and then you had Portuguese invaders and colonists, many of whom stayed on, and then you have black slaves brought over from Africa to work on sugar plantations, and those three different heritage peoples have come together, and mixed race, mixed heritage people is extremely typical in that area. John Agard himself has one Portuguese heritage parent, so one white European parent and one black parent. And he moved to the UK when he was in his 20s, and the date there given is 1977. And at the time, the UK was still quite monocultural in its thinking. There were black communities, there were Asian communities, particularly from places like India and Pakistan, but racism was still absolutely accepted, pretty normal, I would almost say, and it was certainly not something that large numbers of people were worried about, as they are at the moment with the Black Lives Matter movement. And these communities were relatively small compared to the community sizes that we have these days. So it was quite monocultural, mono of course meaning one, so most of the country were white British in their background and to some extent in their thinking. So Agard wants to challenge, the story of the poem here is that he wants to challenge this phrase half-caste, this term, which describes a person of mixed race. He says it diminishes people of mixed heritage like himself. It makes them seem like less than a complete person. They're only half a person. They're not worth as much as somebody who is full one heritage or another. And he says that you need to think about your language. You need to think about how language terms that we have inherited might not be suitable for modern day society, that we ought to be challenging our thinking and being a little bit more open-minded about some of the words we use. It uses non-standard English grammar and spellings, which is the first thing you notice about this poem, really, isn't it? It's spelt funny. It doesn't use full stops. All of those sorts of things, and he does this deliberately because he wants to make the point that he wants it to sound like the way he speaks. He has a sort of strong Caribbean accent, a Creole dialect, which is a sort of mixture of English but also other sounds and other accents that have come down from the sort of slavery heritage, also known as a patois. He doesn't use any punctuation really either in this poem, and that's largely because he wants it to sound quite casual and quite informal, but also he might be saying subtly, he might be using the lack of punctuation as a metaphor for rejecting some of the rules which he experiences in Britain in the 70s and 80s, which he feels are actually rather oppressive to people like himself from minority backgrounds. So he might be kind of rejecting those rules, and rejecting the punctuation is almost a metaphor for that. It's written in free verse, so unlike some of the others which are written in a particular style, like a ballad or a sonnet or something like this, this one is written in free verse. It means it's got no rules about rhyme or stanzas. You can have the line lengths, the rhymes, the rhythms, exactly how you want them. There are no rules. Right, so having done the background to the poem, we'll start to have a look at the poem itself in a bit more detail. So it's written in the first person. The writer speaks directly to the audience, and you can see I've quoted there with "why you." It means you, doesn't it? But he's spelt it differently to reflect his Caribbean Creole dialect. It's slightly accusatory. It's almost like he's wagging a finger in the face of the person who he's talking to. It's a little bit quite ironic, quite sarcastic in style, a little bit angry actually, particularly in the second half of the poem. So there's the title. You can see I've written that it's an archaic term for mixed race or mixed heritage people. Some people do still use it, but it's not a term that's really acceptable these days. But it was at the time that he wrote the poem. Archaic means has fallen out of use. A lot of Shakespeare's language you might describe as archaic. We don't use these and thous anymore. That's what it means. So it's a term that we don't really use anymore, or at least we shouldn't do. And this is what Agard wants us to do. He wants us to think about whether the language we're using is okay. Right, here we go. Excuse me, standing on one leg, he says. I'm half-caste. And if you go and see him perform, John Agard does actually stand on one leg when he performs it. Yeah, does actually stand up on one leg as he opens. Right, so it's a humorous, slightly apologetic start. Excuse me, standing on one leg, he says. You know, he's making a joke out of the fact that he's supposed to only be half a person. But really what it does is it shows how inappropriate the term is, so it immediately establishes this ironic tone. And then we have the first occasion of the refrain. A refrain is like a chorus, a repeated bit in a song or a poem. And he's going to say this several times through the poem. You can see I've circled it in like a bubble when it comes up to it. Explain yourself. What do you mean when you say half-caste? And it's quite challenging, this refrain. It's quite angry almost, isn't it? Explain yourself. That's the kind of thing a teacher or a police officer might say to you if you were in trouble. What do you mean when you say half-caste, he says. And then he begins to use 3 examples of things where they might be, where you mix stuff, but that mixing creates something that is lovely or appreciable or something that we like. And says, well, it's okay to mix those things, so why is it not okay to mix people, he says. What do you mean when you say half-caste, he says. You mean when Picasso mixed red and green, it's a half-caste canvas? So Picasso is a famous European painter. And some of his paintings are not what some people might think of as beautiful, but they're certainly things that are famous and very valuable, and some of them actually are, by anybody's standards, beautiful paintings. So he says, well, hang on, when Picasso has different colours on his painting, you don't call it a half-caste canvas, you say that's a really fabulous painting, or that's really clever, or that's really beautiful. So why do we need to call a person half something if they're mixed? Repeating of the refrain. Oh, and also you've got this / here, which is really the only punctuation in the whole poem. It could be used as a question mark or as a sort of hang on, I'm still thinking kind of punctuation. Alright, he says, let me give you another example. Explain yourself, returns to the refrain. What do you mean when you say half-caste? You mean when light and shadow mix in the sky, it's half-caste weather? So when it's sunny and cloudy at the same time, we call that half-caste weather. He says, no, you don't. Because in that case, he says, well, in that case, England weather nearly always half-caste. In fact, some of them clouds, half-caste till them overcast. So spiteful them don't want the sun to pass our wrath. So he says, well, if we're using the word half-caste to describe a person, then English weather's half-caste weather, because it's usually sunny and cloudy at the same time. Or 2 different sorts of weather. It's hardly ever totally sunny or totally wet or totally cloudy. And don't forget, of course, if he's come from the Caribbean, he's used to a much more reliable sunshine, so he's kind of making a joke about the British weather there as well. He personifies the weather here as spiteful, and the clouds as spiteful. And then we've also got this repetition here with a pun, half-caste till them overcast. The clouds are half-cast till them overcast. And the repetition there works by, it creates some rhythm, doesn't it, and rhyme and emphasis. We notice it more. But it also creates a bit of humour in the pun, because half-caste, he's saying, is a term he doesn't want to hear used for mixed race people, and overcast is what we describe the sky as when it's full of clouds and you can't really see the sunshine. And then he finishes with this Caribbean expression of anger. It means, oh, for goodness sake, or oh, what a load of rubbish, or something like that, or maybe even something a bit ruder. It's like a fairly mild swear. Oh, Ras, what a load of absolute nonsense, he says. And then we've got a third example. So he goes back to his refrain. Explain yourself. What do you mean when you say half-caste? You mean Tchaikovsky sits down at the piano and mixes a black key with a white key as a half-caste symphony? So that's our third example of something that he says is mixed up, but also beautiful. And here we notice we've gone to black and white. So he's actually getting towards his theme, warming up to his theme of race. Not just kind of mixed colours, any old mixed colours, red and green, or mixed weather, sun and cloud, sun and shadow, but actually black and white. So he's moving towards his theme of racial mix. And Tchaikovsky is a famous European composer, very well known indeed, created lots of beautiful music, including lots of ballets. He says what he creates is beautiful, but he needs black and white to do it. We don't call that half-caste, we call that fabulous, we call it beautiful, we call it moving. So we can't call people half of anything. Back up to the top now, second column, right. Last time he uses his chorus, his refrain. Explain yourself, what do you mean? And then he says, he starts to get a little bit angrier, I think, and starts to really try and show how illogical and inappropriate this phrase is. I listening to you with the keen half of me ear. I looking at you with the keen half of me eye. Now keen in this context means sharp. So he said, I'm listening to you and looking at you as hard as I can. See, notice the anaphora there. It's slightly anaphoric, isn't it? Because it's repeated. And usually we think of that anaphora at the beginning of lines. But here it's used at the end, and it has the same effect of creating emphasis and rhythm, just like it does in, for example, Charge of a Light Brigade. So he says, I'm listening really hard. And when I'm introduced to you, I'm sure you'll understand why I offer you half a hand, and when I sleep at night, I close half an eye. Consequently, when I dream half a dream, and when the moon begins to glow, I half-cast human being, cast half a shadow. And of course, when you start to think about that, you think, well, you can't offer a person half a hand to shake. You can't have half an eye. You can't create half a shadow. So he's really showing how ridiculous this phrasing is. And perhaps he's getting a little bit angrier and a little bit crosser as he goes through this second column. And then we have the turning point with our connective, our turning point connective but. And he goes from using his examples and trying to show this is a ridiculous term and it's an unfair term, and it's diminishing him and it's making him and people like this feel like they are not being treated properly as real people. And then he begins to advise us to be more open-minded in future. He says, you must come back tomorrow. He turns his, so he's talking about, I'm looking at you and I'm thinking this and I'm listening to that. And he says, but you need to come back tomorrow with the whole of your ear and the whole of your eye and the whole of your ear and the whole of your mind. He says, you need to be more open-minded. You need to listen properly. You need to get to know me properly. Don't make prejudicial judgments. Don't assume you know anything about me. Come back and listen properly, he says. And then we have this stanza break here. And I will tell you the other half of my story. Find out what I am as a full person. Think of me as a complete person. Don't use this language, this term that diminishes me and makes me less important than you are. And there's no full stop at the end, which perhaps reminds us that this story is unfinished. Right, this poem goes really well with any of the poems which are about prejudice. So it goes well, particularly with No Problem by Benjamin Zephaniah, because No Problem is also about race and about people being racist and people making assumptions about those members of the community who are who have a different skin colour. It also goes quite well with Class Game, because Class Game, although it's not about racial prejudice, it is about prejudice, and it is about people making judgments based on what they see and assuming that other people are lower than them or worth less than them or not as important as they are. So those are the two poems that I think this one goes best with, although there are others that you could connect it to if you absolutely needed to.